안녕하십니까. 이른 아침 이렇게 많이 나와주셔서 감사합니다. 그럼 아침 스페셜 렉처를 곧 시작하도록 하겠습니다. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us for this very timely special lecture on the U.S. trade policy for next year, that is 2019. As you all know very well, the U.S. had midterm elections very recently, which changed the makeup of the U.S. congressional setup. I suppose that change will affect the U.S. trade policy one way or the other. And also we all know in only a matter of few days, President Trump will meet with President Xi Jinping in Buenos Aires on the occasion of G20. I'm sure they will talk about two countries' trade relations and some conflicts. We don't know what the outcome will be, but either way, that will affect the global trading environment and the global trading system itself in very serious way. So, being a highly trade-dependent country, we all are very much interested in those events and outcomes. We are very fortunate this morning to have the best speaker who will enlighten us regarding U.S. trade policy for next year and regarding all the implications of these events and so forth. Dr. Jeffrey Schott has been with us a number of times before, so I don't think he needs a new long introduction. As you know, he has been with Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C. since 1983. And together with his colleagues, Seifred Buxton and Gary Hofbauer, playing a very, very critical role in shaping U.S. trade policies and strategies for almost all previous administrations. I'm not quite sure how important role his colleagues are playing for Mr. Trump nowadays. But in any case, they influenced the U.S. Trade policies and strategies by providing analytical basis for policy choices and the strategy adoptions, and consultative and advisory services. So in fact, they've been very, very effective. Jeff himself, since 1983, wrote so many books and the policy position papers and professional articles. In fact, he wrote for the U.S. The FTA as early as 2001. Yeah, so I suppose that contributed a great deal in launching and successfully launching the Chorus FTA. In any case, we're very fortunate to have him this morning. In fact, he was in town, so I asked him to share some of his speeches, time to meet with us this morning. So he will enlighten us all these issues which all have very, very critical implications for Korea. We have to set up our own policies, trade policies, and adopt appropriate strategies for next year and coming years in this very, very volatile, unpredictable, and uncertain trade environment. Well, with no further ado, I would like to invite Jeffrey Schott to the podium. But before doing that, I would just recognize, actually, Dr. Ambassador An Ho-young, who is our ambassador to U.S. in Washington, and he's with us this morning. And then we have ambassador from Egypt and Sri Lanka. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Well, with this, please join me in welcoming Jeff, Professor. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sagong. It has always been a great pleasure to work with you. We worked together in Washington 3 decades ago, and then you came home, and the first thing I need to do is to congratulate you on the 25th anniversary of your institute, the great success and the great contribution it has made to the understanding of Korea's economy and the role of Korea in the world economy. It's also interesting that our meeting this morning comes on the cusp of the G20, because you played such a prominent role in the last successful G20 meeting when you were chairman during when Korea hosted the G20. And hopefully we will have constructive results this week, but that will be one of the topics of my conversation. My topic is very broad. It's U.S. trade policy in 2019. And predicting trade policy is usually a difficult task. Doing so in the era of Donald Trump requires an ability in gymnastics that I'm not sure I still retain. But I will do my best to try to give you an overview of what I think is likely to happen in the coming months. Surprisingly, the midterm election and the control of the House of Representatives by the Democrats will not have major impacts on U.S. trade policy. If you go into the inner circles of the White House and look for the biggest cheerleaders of Trump's trade policy and the new protection that he has imposed in his first 2 years in office, you will find that it's the leaders of the major labor unions who are the bedrock core constituency of the Democratic Party. So they are very happy with what Trump has done in terms of raising new restrictions, and they look forward to continuing that process in ongoing talks with other friends and allies across oceans, both the Atlantic and the Pacific. But the Democrats don't want to fight Trump about trade because they share the same constituents. They will have plenty to fight Trump about on other issues, more political, and I think they will settle for that. So the agenda, the trade agenda in the Congress is likely to be somewhat limited. The most important task for the Congress will be to consider implementing legislation for the revised NAFTA agreement, which is now called the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement. Note that free trade is no longer part of the title of the North American Accord, and I think that reflects important changes in the agreement in what economists would consider a negative direction. There have been complaints in the Congress about the abuse of authorities that Congress has delegated to the President over the past 50 years. In particular, the authority under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. So it's been around for a long time. No one has used it as aggressively as President Trump, and there is concern in the Congress that he is abusing his power. But efforts to try to rein back the authorities that the Congress has delegated over the years will be unsuccessful because they will be blocked by the Republicans in the Senate. So there will be a little bit of noise, but don't look for the Congress to take any steps to buffer or to constrain President Trump very much on trade policy. The one area where there may be changes is in the development of the implementing legislation for the new USMCA. As you may remember, after the signing of the Chorus FTA in June of 2007, the signing of the agreement did not mean that the agreement was finished, that the negotiations over the agreement were finished. And indeed, it took many years and many rounds of additional negotiations before the United States executive was willing to put implementing legislation before the Congress for a vote. And I think there is a good chance that the revised North American Accord will face additional challenges from many of the president's supporters, and particularly in the area of labor rights and enforcement, and currency. Both that the more protectionist groups in the Congress and in the administration, including the White House, may want to augment the provisions that were in the USMCA so that they will provide a template for negotiations with other countries. And so the Japanese should be very careful in looking at this, but it doesn't mean that the Chorus amendments, which were concluded and hopefully will be implemented by the beginning of next year, it doesn't mean that there won't be additional requests over time to update and expand the Chorus. I can go into more detail on this if you like. The main focus of trade policy will be trade negotiations, and here the White House has already notified Congress of the intent to start negotiations with Japan, the European Union, and the United Kingdom. And it has begun the notification process. It is seeking reports from advisory committees. I have to go back tonight and write on the plane one of the advisory committee reports to present to USTR on Monday on what the U.S. objectives should be. Don't worry, they're not going to listen to me, so you don't. And it's just in the area of environment where the new North American Accord is actually much better than any agreement that has been negotiated so far, even though it is highly deficient in the area of addressing the challenges of climate change. But that's the one area that the Trump administration cares so little about environment and climate change that they paid no attention, and the negotiators actually produced a good agreement on that chapter. So sometimes it's good to be under the radar screen in Washington. So we'll have those new negotiations, possibly not with the United Kingdom, because who knows what the British Parliament is going to do and what the scenarios will be over the next coming months. So that is unclear, but in any event, any deal with the United Kingdom, with any country, cannot be implemented until the United Kingdom is out of the European Union, which means after the end of any transition period, which will take several years at a minimum and maybe longer. So it is not an issue for, while negotiations will take place, the actual impact of a trade agreement with the United Kingdom, whether the US or Korea or anyone else, that's not an issue for this decade. It'll be something towards the middle of next decade. But of course, the focus of everyone in Washington, as Ambassador Ahn knows, is Democrat and Republican, is about bashing China. Not necessarily the best way to get economic reform out of China, but the best way to get domestic political support among disgruntled workers and businesses that have suffered from Chinese competition for a long time. And so it's interesting that while we don't know what will happen in the talks over the next few days, there will be an incentive for both the Democrats and for President Trump to maintain that they are tougher on China than the other. And so that will complicate the process of putting a deal together, but the substantive challenges are a big enough problem. So let me say a few words about what I see on U.S.-China relations in the near term. We've now had retaliation, increased tariffs on bilateral trade that affect about half of U.S. imports from China and almost 70% of Chinese imports from the United States. Both countries are worse off because of the retaliation. No one wins from a trade war. It's a question of who is relatively less worse off, but we're definitely worse off. And both the United States and China have strong economic interests in constraining new protection and resolving differences, or at least preventing the problem from getting worse. And so the immediate task is to try to prevent the next stage of tariff escalation, which is scheduled to take place on January 1st, when $200 billion of Chinese shipments to the United States, already subject to 10% tariffs, will go up to 25% tariffs. A lot of those goods are consumer goods. A lot of telecommunications goods, computers, and other things. 10% had an impact on the U.S. consumer, but it was masked by the very strong U.S. economic growth. 25% will be noticed, particularly as the U.S. economy begins to weaken over the coming 12 to 24 months. And so it is a narrow path to walk for President Trump, because he wants price stability in the U.S. market, but he wants to punish and look like he's punishing China. This he's already accomplished to some extent, because one of Trump's objectives was not only to reduce the trade deficit, because everything he's doing is going to have no impact on the trade deficit. Actually, the bilateral deficit with China has gone up this year as Trump has put more and more measures on, in part because the U.S. dollar has strengthened because of the uncertainties and concern about the trade war. But he has reached a political goal, and the political goal is a very simple one. For Trump, he gets a great advantage just by imposing tariffs on China, because that's what he promised his supporters he would do. And he said he would impose across-the-board tariffs on all Chinese trade. And he's on his way to doing that. And his supporters, who understand economics as well as Trump's economic advisors, are content that Trump is going to do what he promised to do. And so he gets a lot of domestic political credit among disgruntled segments of the U.S. political spectrum. And those people have been critical at the margin in producing victories for Republican candidates and actually putting Donald Trump in the office. And they will be necessary and critical for Trump's reelection. On the Chinese side, they obviously don't want to have this problem on top of the multitude of problems that already exist in the Chinese economy. And they need to pursue domestic economic reforms. And interestingly, when Xi Jinping gave his major speech at the Shanghai International Import Expo earlier this month, he highlighted all the things that China would do on domestic economic reforms, including lifting foreign equity caps on investments in financial services and autos and other service sectors. He emphasized the need for strengthening e-commerce and the new Hainan Free Trade Port and Zone, the biggest one in China, which is actually his signature initiative. So he is personally invested in that. He committed to cutting tariffs to increase competition in the domestic market. Already did so to some extent on autos, and to do more on services and investment. Where he didn't say anything, and this was notable by its absence, was he said nothing about disciplining subsidies for state-owned enterprises and for dealing with the backlog of bad debt that plague those enterprises and the Chinese economy as a whole. That is critical to making progress with the United States over the near to medium term, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there might not be an early harvest package or a down payment on further talks that the Chinese might bring to Buenos Aires. And that could include more purchases of soybeans and cars, liquefied natural gas and crude oil that could be more than the Chinese offered when they were negotiating with Treasury Secretary Mnuchin earlier in the year, and Trump vetoed that deal. But if they have a deal that Trump agrees with Xi Jinping, and the headline says Trump gets more from Xi Jinping and continues to keep the pressure on by not removing the tariffs, then you could see him saying, I've done what other presidents weren't able to do. And that's basically what he likes. So there's the possibility that China could do what is economically sensible and remove the retaliation that they imposed in some products in response to the U.S. Trade measures. They can also buy more energy and use that as an excuse or as an argument to say, we will buy more energy from you and from the U.S., and the more energy China buys from the United States, the less energy China has to buy from Iran. China is Iran's, along with India, China and India are Iran's major customers. And there was a great concern that the U.S. would impose sanctions on November 5th against Chinese state-owned energy firms and financial institutions doing business in Iran. China got a 6-month waiver. India got a waiver. European Union did not get a waiver, interesting enough. And so that, to me, was an early signal that Trump was giving another 6-month horizon for trying to build up negotiations. But Trump changes his minds, between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m., and then again after whatever he does in the morning, after Fox News. But I am cautiously optimistic that that we might see at least a handshake and something constructive coming out of Buenos Aires, even if it's only a very small step, but a small step away from new retaliation. The beauty of making that prediction is that by Sunday you can say, well, Schott was wrong on that one, and then we can move on from there. Now, going forward, though, even if they are successful in having an initial preliminary, tentative, however it is described, agreement, there will be continuing problems and growing problems, because there are frictions with state-owned enterprises that are not going away. Xi Jinping vowed stronger enforcement of intellectual property laws and harsher penalties, but didn't get into the ways that technology and intellectual property is misappropriated. And that will be a difficult task given the nature of the Chinese regime. And it will take some time to figure out constructive means to build a policy that begins to discipline and prevent and constrain the misappropriation of technology, either through investment relationships or through cyber means, which is another area that has not been making much progress since President Obama reached an agreement with Xi Jinping in September of 2015. So we have those continuing tensions, and I think Trump will soon grow impatient with the slow, incremental pace of Chinese economic reform. Trump likes immediate gratification, and he will get it in terms of, he can get it in terms of a purchasing agreement on particular products, but on the key problems of involving investment and intellectual property, that's going to take much more work, and an approach that the Chinese are willing to take over a decade or more. But Trump's horizon is very short-term. The increase in the U.S. deficit with China will also could fuel another temper tantrum in the White House. As Trump says, how can this be? We imposed all these restrictions. The deficit should be going down, according to his understanding of economics. And so the logical explanation in the White House will be China is cheating. And you already heard harsh rhetoric out of Vice President Pence at the APEC meetings, and the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. There is a continuing war between the China hawks and, well, there aren't any internationalists left in the administration, so that's a very sad comment. But since Gary Cohn left, there is much less buffer on extreme economic policy in the White House. And there's likely to be new friction over Iran sanctions by the spring, because China is not going to stop buying oil from Iran. And push comes to shove, that's going to create problems. So I can talk more about that if necessary. The talks with Japan are likely to get underway in the second half of January. And the Japanese, after valiant efforts to prevent trade negotiations from starting, have committed a few months ago to new negotiations on a U.S.-Japan trade agreement. No free trade anymore, trade agreement. The main U.S. goal in that negotiation is to increase U.S. auto production and jobs. So, consistent with what the United States did in the revised NAFTA, the U.S. demand will be undoubtedly, though they haven't said this explicitly, undoubtedly a reduction in Japanese exports of autos and parts to the United States and an increase in Japanese investment in existing or new auto facilities in the U.S. market. The extent to which that is done under quota will be a subject of negotiation. I suspect there will be some limitations from existing levels, in part because the U.S. Consumer demand for passenger cars is weakening. And so there's room to make adjustments without actually biting into market share of Japanese companies in the short term. But the way the U.S. negotiators pursued the NAFTA makes it almost imperative that new restrictions be placed on foreign competition from Europe and Japan. Because the new U.S. rules of origin in the NAFTA will raise production costs in the U.S. market. And most companies would just pay the MFN tariff of 2.5% and forget about NAFTA. But the administration has threatened 232 measures that would raise the MFN tariff to 20 or 25%. And so Mexico and Canada, under duress, agreed to voluntary export restraints, though at levels that are slightly above current trade. The Europeans are being asked to do the same thing, and they have rejected that. And in fact, while the U.S. and Japan have a way of reaching an agreement on an agenda for negotiations, which will look a bit like TPP, but won't be called that, which will involve more a revival of Japanese concessions to the United States on agriculture and some services, but will not involve U.S. commitments to anybody. Trump does not make concessions to other countries. When he negotiates, his bargaining chips are, I will take away the chips that I gave you before unless you agree to what I demand. And so it's a negative bargaining chip strategy. And it worked with Mexico because the Mexicans agreed to a deal that will harm the Mexican economy, no doubt about that. And I've talked to former President Cedillo and other leaders, and they say this is not a good deal for the Mexican economy, except it is a much better deal than we expect we would have had if we didn't accept the restrictive NAFTA, because they believed that Trump would rip up the agreement and cause great harm to the Mexican economy. On Japan, I think after a long period of consultation, there's recognition that Japan is going to have to do a little too. And this is going to hurt both economies. The Europeans probably don't have the political mandate to pursue such negotiations. And Trump has been vehement about autos, has been vehement about including agriculture, has been vehement about excluding government procurement from U.S.-European talks, and the European position is just exactly the opposite. And on top of that, they're not happy that they're the subject of Iran sanctions. So politically, it will be much more difficult for U.S.-European talks to start. And so the main focus of trade negotiations will likely be on Japan. And unfortunately, that's going to focus all of the attention on Japan. And perhaps that's the way they like to do it. Take one country at a time and pressure them and till an agreement is reached. There is a focus on energy trade with Japan that could help improve U.S.-Japan trade relations and moderate the protectionist demands of the United States in manufacturing sectors. But how much that happens is unclear. So there's a lot I could say more about the Japanese talks, the European talks, talks with China. Almost nothing to say about the about the UK talks, because from everything I have heard and talked to with British officials, they still don't know what they're doing. They have a very competent chief trade negotiator from New Zealand, who was a TPP negotiator for New Zealand and an official at the OECD and the WTO, so he knows his stuff. But he needs about 100 people like him, and that just, they don't have it in London. So I don't expect much on that front. The last thing to say about trade issues is the one where that the Trump administration gives the least attention to, and that's the WTO. The WTO is now in grave crisis. It's already in grave crisis. It's not pending. It's already here. There haven't been negotiations in a long time to update the rule book. There's increasing pressure on the dispute settlement process to adjudicate disputes that are either not covered by existing rules or seem to involve the gray area of the WTO obligations. And the panelists are trying to do their best to resolve differences, but in a way that inevitably expands the scope of WTO obligations due to their judicial rulings. The United States has objected to that and has blocked appointments to the appellate body to the extent that we now only have 3 members. You need 3 members to field a panel to hear a dispute, an appeal. And if it's an appeal involving the United States or China, well, one of the 3 members is American, one is Chinese. You're not going to get a panel. You will, because of the recusal. So we have a major problem here, and Trump doesn't seem to care. They are unhappy with 3 aspects of the WTO, or the evolution of the trading system from the immediate post-war period. And I can summarize them very clearly. The first concern is the level of MFN tariffs. President Trump feels the U.S. MFN tariffs are too low. We gave too much, too often, throughout the 8 rounds of multilateral trade negotiations, and we should have the right to raise tariffs. Well, we have the right in the WTO to raise tariffs, but we have to pay for it, and Trump doesn't want to pay for it. So he found, through his bright legal minds at USTR, that there is a loophole if you aggressively use the national security exemption, and that he is using to raise MFN tariffs in key sectors. His second concern is overreach by dispute settlement judges, what I just mentioned. And Ambassador Lighthizer has given him some examples where Lighthizer lost cases when he was in private practice, and the rulings went against the U.S. Most rulings in the WTO have favored the U.S. position, but that statistic is fake news. And the third problem is the lack of what they call the lack of discipline on Chinese industrial policies. They say China is cheating. But actually, China has, in large measure, and certainly now, agreed to the letter of the law, if not the spirit of the law. But the law is inadequate. There are too many holes. They do not cover the types of industrial policies and subsidization and government support for industry that have become prevalent and dominant in the Chinese economy. We could have had negotiations to work on that, but the Doha round failed, and that wasn't the U.S. fault, and it wasn't China's fault. It was the fault of developing countries, and particularly India. So right now, Trump is satisfied to let the WTO wither on the vine until people get so scared that the whole trading system is going to collapse that they will come and accept all the U.S. conditions. And he's willing to play that game of chicken. It's bad for the system. It's bad for investors. It's bad for economic growth in the United States and around the world. It's bad for the rule of law and trying to advance the rule of law in countries that are struggling to develop a system of governance that is less corrupt and more market-oriented. And there's a big economy that says it wants to be less corrupt and more market-oriented, and we're doing exactly the opposite by damaging the WTO in trying to push it in that direction. So there's a lot more that could be said on a lot of different issues. I've talked for the time allotted so that we have time for questions. I'd say that looking forward in 2019, despite the defeat of President Trump in the House of Representatives, we're likely to see a continuation of his policies. And U.S. trade policy will lead to more friction and limited cooperation. And it will challenge U.S. allies, even ones where we have already reached agreement, because that is not permanent. Trade relations evolve over time. But it will also have much more major consequences given the friction with Europe and what that means for U.S. relations with Russia and the Middle East. So a lot of complicated factors going in. That trade policy has become increasingly integrated with foreign and security policy, but not well integrated in the formulation of U.S. trade, of U.S. policy. That's something that U.S. officials are not learning by doing, because they're not learning. And I've never seen a situation like this in the almost 50 years that I've been in Washington. And I've been in both Republican and Democratic administrations, so it is not an ideological issue. This is a radical shift in the way U.S. officials are doing business. And it is meant to restructure not only supply chains on the economic side, but global alliances on the strategic side. And it's something we need to work with very carefully, and we need the wise counsel and support of our friends in the Asia-Pacific region to help bring more coherence into U.S. policy. So on that somber note, let me finished my prepared remarks, and I'd be happy to answer questions on all areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much for very, very comprehensive but very, very detailed descriptions and analysis of what's going on, particularly under the President Trump's leadership. Korea is undoubtedly one of the most benefited countries in the world from the post-World War II international trading system and regime, which is based on multilateralism and supported by the U.S. leadership. And now that is changing, and Korea is much more trade dependent than U.S. is, and therefore we have to realize the reality, and we have to find the best ways to survive and do well under such circumstances. But as Jeff Schott illuminated, I don't think the situation will be changed in the near future, but the situation will go on for some time. Chinese, I don't think the Chinese will easily give up their own China dream, and they have their own grand strategy. And so we have to live with it, and I think the challenges for Korea is much higher than our stakes. So, well, with this, why don't we open the floor for questions and comments? Yes, Dr. Kim, yes.
Dr. Schott, thank you very much for your very insightful presentation, particularly concerning the fact that the trade policy will have a very little impact, even if the Congress turn to the Democratic, because it's such the same on the round the support force. But I'm afraid it is not just the labor force which is that. I believe there is a greater support for the anti-trade, free trade sentiment in the United States, and it's largely due to one aspect. Economists never questioned the value of free trade ever since David Ricardo's comparative advantage theory. No economist with the same mind has ever questioned the value of free trade because it benefits both sides. But consistently what economists never addressed is the fact that how is that benefit shared between the two parties? Now, this didn't matter because, as Dr. Sago just pointed out, Korea benefited tremendously with the trade with the United States. And of course, Korea got a greater part of the benefits. This didn't matter when US was trading with the smaller countries. It becomes a big issue when it turns to China. Now, even if US gets advantage out of the trade, getting extra 1% growth a year, if China gets 3% or 5% or 10%, guess what happens? Hegemonic power shifts. And when you are dealing with a country like China, which has 3 times or 4 times the population of the United States, and their growth is faster than the United States, it doesn't matter whether the United States takes advantage of this trade or not, eventually you lose the hegemonic power to China. Now, people, without analyzing this, has inside that's a fear and dislike about this. So this goes way beyond just labor. I think, in that sense, this is a high time the economists change their mind from not just addressing dollars and cents of gain in both sides gain, but what it does have the effect of this uneven share of the benefits, and in particular when it deals with the geopolitical hegemonic issues. And it's a high time we should look at that instead of just saying that, hey, it's just economically both sides gain or lose. Thank you.
Okay. Why don't you invite another? Dr. An, please.
Pleasure to meet you again. You know, I would like to recall that several years ago, you visited Korea to present economic impact of TPP, original member 12, and then you went on, okay, TPP 12 plus Korea. You campaigned very hard for Korea to join TPP, but President Trump turned around the entire picture of the TPP. So, I would like to hear your reflection on what happened. Yes. What I'm afraid is that the liberal international order is under great challenge under the Trump administration. If he is elected again, maybe the liberal international order might disappear in a sense, fully, and not a temporary phenomenon. So, how would you see the fate of liberal, the international, under President Trump if he's re-elected? And second question, you mentioned about the U.S. and the China, the free trade negotiation. Seems to me is same as U.S. rejoining the TPP 11. So what is the chances of the U.S. coming back to join the TPP 11? If that happens, and I personally view that South Korea should join as second batch group, although we might pay some re-entry cost to TPP 11. After seeing the U.S. also join, that. So what is the prospect of that possibility? And third question, if China does not really respond to the satisfaction of the President Trump, maybe U.S. might use, the currency war weapon and designating the China as a currency, manipulator and something like that. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Okay. These are all excellent questions. Yeah. I will give a brief response and not a full response, because otherwise we'll be finished. You're absolutely right on the distribution issue. U.S. policy has been deficient with regard to managing adjustment of firms and workers affected by international competition. Our programs are meager compared to most industrial countries. They are underfunded, and the funding has been restricted and continues to be constrained by the budget deficits that are growing because of the U.S. tax cuts. So we have hurt ourselves by not adjusting, by not investing in infrastructure, by not investing in education, by doing all the things that a normal country would do to improve its competitiveness. And we've been doing this for decades now. We had such an advantage that we could live off of our fat, but it's now affecting our competitiveness. So, and we don't have the money to do it. We don't have the money for infrastructure investment. The Republicans don't want to fund worker adjustment. They would rather put up protection, which is a way of redistributing income, but not in an efficient way. And that's what we're doing so far. We have made steel executives rich in the United States. They've given a little bit to the steel workers, and they've paid for it out of the pockets of everyone else in the U.S. economy, all other manufacturers and consumers. So that's not going to change because we don't have money. We're broke. President comes from the real estate business. That's a business where you're highly leveraged and you depend on low interest rates. Well, he's highly leveraged the U.S. economy, much more than even before. And he had low interest rates, but now the Fed is beginning to incrementally raise them in a responsible way. He doesn't like that, and that's why he's attacking the Fed. The way to deal with China as a hegemonic power, I will discuss in answering the other questions. I think when you look at the global trading system, the brightest part of the system is the fact that the 11 TPP countries went forward with a comprehensive and high standard trade agreement. And they got the poorest countries among them to accept. Vietnam ratified the agreement 2 weeks ago. And Malaysia hasn't yet, but has to. Otherwise, they'll lose all their investment to Vietnam. So they have kept intact the framework for an updated and modernized international trade rulebook. That is only going to be sustainable if the TPP 11 expands. There are a lot of countries that want to join, and they will begin to queue up at the end of December. But the TPP 11 needs more major economies. And the Brits are interested, but that's next decade. Korea would make a big impact on the sustainability and the economic and political profile of the CPTPP. It can do so in a way that's beneficial to Korea's relations with its major trading partners in the region. It needs an understanding from the 11 countries that you don't try to press for the last ounce of concession when you're getting a lot of benefit from an agreement that will be greatly enhanced by Korean participation. So if anything, I feel even stronger today about the importance of Korean participation in the TPP than I did 2 years ago. Will this be enough to bring Donald Trump back to the table? No. He's not interested in anything other than one-on-one deals. So even if the one-on-one deal mimics a lot of what the TPP is. If you look at the NAFTA, the revised NAFTA, a large part of what's in the revised NAFTA is TPP. The same provisions that he rejected with Canada and Mexico and the other countries in January of 2017, he accepted on September 30th and is going to sign on Friday. So same thing goes with the U.S.-Japan talks, that they will include a lot of TPP provisions. It won't change U.S. policy. And interestingly, it's not going to change, the NAFTA didn't change Canada and Mexico's policy because they are already going to implement the deal long before the revised NAFTA ever gets brought before Congress. So I think the importance of expanding the agreement to new members, expanding and broadening its economic footprint will be important as a counterpoint to Chinese economic interest in the region. China has not, Xi Jinping did not say he wanted to negotiate with the TPP 11, but he said he wanted to negotiate with Japan and Korea. Japan and Korea would be in a better position to negotiate with China with 11, 12, 15 countries on its side. And so I think that's something that needs to be reconsidered. On the currency question, China is not manipulating its currency for commercial advantage. It's doing the opposite. It's actually challenged to try to find a way of avoiding competitive depreciation of the renminbi, which would only exacerbate the trade tensions. And so there's no way that the Treasury could find the Chinese in violation of the terms of U.S. law. But that doesn't mean that the Democrats and President Trump may not want to change U.S. law. And there was draft legislation, Ambassador Ahn was familiar with this, several years ago that would have totally distorted the countervailing anti-dumping system and added currency provisions, which would have violated WTO obligations. There are people in Washington and very close personal advisors to the president who want to revive those provisions. So that's a danger going forward. We have to rely on the competence of the U.S. Treasury and finance ministers around the world to prevent that.
Okay, Dr. Lee Kyung-ki.
Thank you. I have two questions. One is, what is the chance of the Korea's auto industry being taken from either our either our export or our investment into US? And secondly, you said that the current situation in the White House and in the US administration has never been observed for the last 50 years. And this is quite totally new phenomenon. And then I'm curious to know that who are the grand designers of this new strategy to change U.S. either politically, economically, or socially. Undoubtedly, Trump will be on the list. But can you tell us the few other the key members who may be on the list to design the new America?
Let me address the last one first, because I can do it easily. The people who are the designers of U.S. policy are the people who agree with Donald Trump. And they continue to work for the administration as long as they continue to agree with Donald Trump. And so on trade policy in particular, and the Chinese learned this the hard way, there's only one trade official, trade negotiator in the U.S. administration, and that's Donald Trump. Robert Lighthizer is the executioner of the objectives that Trump puts forward. So that partially answers your second one. Lighthizer has proven his loyalty and his competence in raising U.S. import barriers, and so he is gaining more authority. But that authority is contingent on him saying things that Trump wants to hear. And fortunately for Lighthizer, he and Trump are of the same mind, and both of them have been strongly protectionist since the early 1980s. So this is not something new for Trump on trade policy. He's had public statements, protectionist statements for a long time. On Korean autos, we've had a sharp increase in the sales of Korean branded cars in the U.S. market. Hyundai and Kia are affected by the slowdown in domestic demand for passenger cars, but they account for about 8% of U.S. sales now, and they source about 50% of their sales in the U.S. market from U.S. plants, up from 30% just a decade ago. So there has been a shift, and part of it, that shift has been beneficial for the Korean companies because they have increased sales. But the Trump administration is unhappy with the trade balance numbers, which are still very large in the auto sector, autos and parts, and represent, in most years, almost the entire bilateral merchandise deficit with Korea. Now, fortunately, during the time of negotiating the amendments to the chorus, the bilateral U.S. deficit with Korea, goods and services, improved. Our merchandise deficit went down, and our services surplus went up. And so our bilateral deficit in goods and services with Korea is so small it shouldn't be notable by anyone. But Trump doesn't focus on services, he only focuses on manufacturing. And because it's mostly in autos, that's still a bone of contention. Now, what was odd in the chorus amendments was that Trump didn't demand major changes in the rules of origin. In fact, in terms of Korean exports to the U.S., the only change really was to postpone the elimination of the light truck tariff for 20 years. That doesn't affect current trade flows, but it blocks any future export opportunity of Korean companies. But everything else was left intact. And in fact, most of the chorus was left intact. From an agreement that Trump said was terrible to one that he said is wonderful. You look at it and he said, well, how did he make that transition? He made that transition because Korea agreed on the side to substantial restrictions on steel exports. And that's what Trump wanted.
Yeah, Professor Min, yes, our Indian ambassador.
Can you compare the contrast between the U.S. approach to deal with Japan in 1980s and the current approach to deal with China in containing the rising hegemony or war between the two?
And then why don't you invite ambassadors?
Thank you, Dr. Schott. I have a question and a comment. My question is about the issue of the current trade policies. I mean, both intellectuals from trade area and national security advisors, they kind of frame it in two ways. One of them is the issue of the joint competition between China and the US. And if that is the case, and if that's the essence of the issue, would it be, I mean, a very simple, straightforward tactic, and that the US would be much better off galvanizing all the allies to put pressure on China to reform? The game could be, I don't know, it's up to you. I'd like to have you be much more than opening all fronts at the same time, like pressuring Japan, pressuring Korea, pressuring the NF, and so on, and then China. It might be self-defeating in them. And it's a very simple argument. How do you think President Trump used this? My comment is, I was a little bit disturbed by a comment you made about that the Doha round and its failure was because of developing countries. I just have a very straightforward comment to make on that. I think the WTO, after the Uruguay round, went through a very severe governance crisis, and I think it's not out of it. And part of it because simply the system was very strong power politics system, and they were to sign the Uruguay. And I think its results was catastrophic in many ways for many developing countries. Not necessarily because it was a bad deal, but also because institutionally they were not ready to absorb its results. And I think by the time Doha came, they have not yet absorbed Uruguay and understanding how to implement it. So I mean, this is a serious, description of what happened more than it was an intentional move to block any further progress or to block the playground. It's really, the governments were so thin, their backs against the wall, that they would have lost all credibility if they accepted another deal without having to go first in the proper way, which they could not, for many institutional reasons more than other reasons as well.
Okay. U.S.-Japan in the 80s and U.S.-China in the current period, a major similarity, and I didn't have the time to go into this, was the attack on investment in the U.S. market. There was a concern in Japan that Japan was buying up all of the crown jewels of the U.S. economy, even Rockefeller Center. I remember talking to David Rockefeller about this, and I said, "How could you? It had your name on it, and you were selling it to the Japanese." And he looked at me and he said, "They were offering me such a ridiculously high price. I wouldn't have been a Rockefeller if I had turned it down." But there was an attitude towards Japan as number one, a famous book that was 180 degrees wrong on so many issues. But there was that similar type of concern that you see now with Chinese investment in the U.S. And so the U.S. has passed two major pieces of legislation this past year to strengthen the monitoring, surveillance, and restriction of foreign investment by China and other countries that engage in, that involve the access to high technologies. Actually, they call it foundational and emerging technologies. So who knows what that is? And it could be as elastic a definition as they want. And that's what scares business. This could be, it's created a lot of uncertainty, and Chinese foreign investment in the United States has dried up this year. Almost nothing. Trump, of course, also wants to block U.S. investment in China because he wants U.S. companies to invest in the United States. He doesn't want them to invest in China. So that's a major similarity. The 80s was also known for voluntary export restraints of Japanese goods. That they're not reviving with China, they're reviving that with Japan. They would have done it on steel, but China doesn't sell much steel to the United States because it's all blocked by anti-dumping and countervailing duties. So those are two main areas. Big difference, though, is Japan was and still is a major ally and strategic partner of the United States. And so when push came to shove, there was some deference to the overall strategic relationship reflected in trade negotiations. And that doesn't exist in the U.S.-China context. Now, on the WTO, I actually fully agree with you on the harshness of the Uruguay round deal. It was a take it or leave it. We're moving out of the GATT into a new home, and you can only move into the home with us if you accept all of the obligations that you weren't required to accept in the first 50 years of the GATT. That would have been okay if there had been provisions in the agreement to help support the adjustment of developing countries, provide more reasonable transition periods, but also to provide technical and financial assistance. There was nothing. Trade policy has always been a means of foreign policy by the cheap, off budget. And so the burdens on developing countries were significant. The drafting of the Doha agenda reflected the developing country concerns. And so I'm not really talking about the Doha agenda in 2001. I was talking about when we had the opportunity to have a deal in 2008. Essentially, India screwed it up, but there wasn't enough action to block India, as was taken at the launch of the Doha round, when many developing countries said, no, we have to have new negotiations for differing reasons, and we can't let India block the launch of new negotiations. So that's consistent. It also links to the very first question I had about distribution of gains from trade. what applies at the national level also needs to apply at the international level if you're going to have a sustainable system. And for 30 or 40 years, Fred Bergston and I have tried to have a more coherent policy among the World Bank, the IMF, the OECD, and the WTO, or the GATT and the WTO. That is now more, those institutions are now working more closely together than they ever have, but they don't have the support of the major countries to move forward. So there's been this disconnect. Last point on the WTO, because this is important. Developing countries need to reassess what can be done in the WTO to advance a modern agenda while at the same time getting expedited attention to their traditional concerns about agriculture. That's going to be a lot harder now than it was in 2008. Because when agricultural prices were high, it was easy to get countries to agree to discipline their subsidies because you didn't have to give subsidies when prices were high. When prices fall, then those programs kick in and politicians don't want to take money out of the pockets of farmers. So it's a bigger challenge now, one that we're still working on, and Gary Huffmeyer and I are going to try yet another attempt to find a way of balancing the interests of both developed and developing countries. But we now have the additional challenge of trying to figure out how to get the United States to play at least a constructive role.
Yes, I guess. Last question.
This question is might not attractive for trade policy, but let me ask you. Quite recently, I heard the rumor that many Chinese companies they borrowed money, big money, outside of China in U.S. dollars, in a very low interest rate, and they covered it up as the money for export, and then they bring it back to China to invest, so-called the shadow banking. The interest gap should be something like at least 5 or 6% interest rate gaps. Plus, they may benefit the appreciation of the yuan currency. If that is true, then the China should be much more exposed to this kind of U.S. interest rate hike. A period of time, they are very vulnerable in the financial sector as well. What do you think about this kind of rumor? If this rumor is true, well, if I have experience in 1997 or 1998 in Korea, we have the same sort of the experience at the time. The interest gap between the international borrowing money and the domestic interest rate was so high at the time, about the 6 or 7% interest rate gaps. So a lot of the Korean companies, especially the financial companies, they borrow money in Hong Kong, huge money, and then they bring it back to Korea. They all assume that the interest gap should remain as they were, and exchange rate, they don't pay any attention for that exchange rate at all at the time. That causes one of the biggest harsh time that Korea ever faced before. So if that is the truth, then the China may have some big problems. I want to hear your comment about that.
Well, I have colleagues who are much more knowledgeable of the intricacies of Chinese finance than I am. So I would refer you to the Peterson Institute website. Dr. Sagong is much more expert than I on this. It's interesting though, based on official statistics of the Chinese government, about 70% of their overseas direct investment goes to the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands. So if that money stayed there, those islands would sink under the weight of all that money. So obviously there are various types of transactions going on. The Chinese are looking very carefully at U.S. interest rates, not only because of the impact on lending, but also its impact on the value of the dollar. And the combination of ingredients has only complicated further the effort at exchange rate management. So I will leave it at that. I don't want to tread on Nick Lardy and others toes, but you have to be very careful and clear and specific on answering your question. And I'd rather have somebody who's been studying all the statistics to do that. Now, I forgot to answer Ambassador Fahmy's point on essentially piling on China. And a piling on strategy is not going to work in the WTO because you need consensus among all the major trading nations to get anything significant done. Once you have that consensus, then you can work out the side payments to countries to allow them to come back home and accept an agreement. But if you target China specifically, then China is not going to accept new obligations that only target China. And other countries are going to look at that example and they say, well, if they could do this to China, we have much less influence, and then the United States will just go and really hit us. So a lot of developing countries and others, and the Russians and others will back off. So the initial hope, and this was only a hope outside of the administration, was that the United States, Europe, and Japan would get together to begin to develop new draft obligations on e-commerce and on state-owned enterprises and the like that could serve as a foundation for engagement with China. But it's very hard to pursue that successfully when you started bashing all those countries with sanctions, oil sanctions, and with steel tariffs. And in fact, one OECD meeting, right after they signed the declaration to cooperate on WTO, the next day the United States imposed tariffs, and everyone forgot about the WTO declaration. So that's why I mean the U.S. policy is inconsistent and often incoherent.
Okay, with this we have to end this very special lecture this morning with Jeff Schott. Being a former U.S. government policymaker and a trade negotiator, in fact, he was U.S. team of negotiating Tokyo round in the 80s.
70s.
I mean 70s, yeah. And he was senior official at the U.S. Treasury, and he is a scholar. And he is really hard-working scholar and a traveler, and he's such a prolific writer. And of course, Fred Wilson is workaholic, and they are in good competition. In any case, he has very, very busy schedule all the time, and he's one of the most highly demanded speakers nowadays because of trade issue. Not necessarily because he's close to Mr. Trump, but
I guess you got that impression. Huh?
but his analytical prowess, I think, is very, and knowledge is very highly demanded.
I actually was very close to Mr. Trump when I was a young boy. We lived about 8 miles apart.
Yeah, he is a New York boy as well. So, but anyway, so we can go on, and because of his unique background, actually, he can tell us any other scholars cannot tell. It's the details and behind really nitty-gritty of trade negotiations and so forth. So that is the reason why we should get him back more frequently, and I'm sure he will be back to Seoul. So, and we've been friends, as he said, for more than 3 decades now, and we'll go on. And
Yeah, absolutely.
we'll get you back. So please join me in thanking Jill for excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you.